So we're going to kick things off with Eric.
Well, hi. I mean, I don't have to say we're very relieved that Trump is gone, that he's been defeated. I'm sure you all, I don't have to go into details, what a right-wing, racist, misogynist, abuser of women, implementing everything for the rich, cutting the richest taxes, shredding regulations, anti-labor, etc. I mean, some of that is par for the course, but he just seemed to go further in everything. His ties to the far right were unprecedented. How he essentially acted as a recruiting agent, really, for the far right, and the blatant weaponization of racism in his statements on immigration, etc. Personally, he was a narcissist and a habitual liar and incompetent, but nonetheless got away with things that people thought, would have been impossible, and that way lowered the bar. And finally, as he denied global warming, he also denied the threat of coronavirus and basic public health measures, so that by election day, we'd reached a total of 200,000 Americans killed by by COVID-19 and 90,000 new infections on that day. So after all that, the fact that he still got 47.6% of the vote and a majority in many states is very worrying. It's also an indictment of Biden's campaign and of the nature of the Democratic Party. So now a good proportion of those Trump voters are angry, thinking the president has been stolen from them, and amidst of them is a far right that's come out of the shadows. And at the same time, we have Biden, a neoliberal politician who will not talk in class terms and will not institute policies that benefit the working class. So this combination means the worrisome aspects of Trumpism are not over. But yet, the Black Lives Matter movement, it won over the majority of the country to see the racism of the police force. It pushed through small changes all over that years of lobbying and electoral work would not have accomplished. More importantly, it's a huge move to have millions of white folks siding with oppressed Black people on the street and more at home and at work identifying with those demonstrations. It shows that the mood is there and it's possible to combat this division. It also means that the left in the US, which in some ways is growing but is still very weak, has its work cut out for us. So the election, 160 million people voted. 67% of eligible voters in the United States is a very big turnout, the biggest since 1900. But this was supposed to benefit Biden, but it was still close. Both sides turned out more people than the last election. 50.7% voted against Trump. In a way, it looked like 4 years ago all over again. The maps, the states stayed mostly the same. Most Republicans voted Republican. Biden won by squeaking by in switching a few Midwest Rust Belt states that had barely gone to Trump last time, barely went to Biden this time, and he won. So who voted for him and why? There's a lot of talk about his use of racism. Certainly, Trump was using racism and xenophobia to deflect the blame for economic problems, and also using that fear to get the law and order vote. But that was only partly successful. Most of America is more mixed than it was, and the white working class is appreciably less racist than it was when Nixon used that strategy in the 60s, for example. Many Trump voters had voted for Obama and then been disappointed. Trump's line was anti-Black Lives Matter. They're horrible. They're burning things down. The Democratic mayors are allowing the rioting. And Biden gets in, he will destroy the suburbs. The suburbs are also more integrated already, and that actually did not work. He did not win the suburbs through that. It did affect some people in more isolated areas, and the distinction grew between Republican rural and small towns and the Democratic big cities. But at least as important was this false choice between coronavirus protection and the economy. In a poll, when asked to choose between his priorities, 77% who chose health voted for Biden, and 86% who chose the economy chose Trump. Luckily, more said health was their first priority. We all know talk of the economy is one thing is misleading. This COVID-19 recession has been the most unequal in US history. decimating workers and small businesses, while top executives are still raking in millions. This inequality is something Sanders would have focused on, but not Biden. So in the debates, Trump looked like the guy who talked about jobs. Biden was told by his campaign, don't criticize rich people because a lot of working people want to be rich. So, you know, Trump had done this before. I will be the greatest jobs president that God has ever created, although he didn't. His, you know, infrastructure project, nothing happened. All his talk about trade wars were, you know, based on ideas of U.S. jobs, and the sanctions as a net, they didn't actually create jobs. But he still used the coronavirus lockdown and his lack of action to then blame the local Democrats for public health measures for the decline in the economy. He was helped in this by the far right's role in the armed reopen protest, but he was also helping it in that Biden and the Democrats were not, you know, arguing around working class issues, were not arguing about jobs. During the start of the campaign, Trump and Biden were in a war about who could be toughest on China, not about who could, you know, who could help the working class. The problem with this, so Biden could not, you know, attract a working class vote on that basis. But there's also a problem with the analysis that Trump won the working class, or even the white working class. There's no measure of what class you are in these exit polls, and they're often based on these ideas that the one figure that white people with no college education voted 67% for Trump. But we all know a lot of unionized workers have college educations. We also know that a lot of people without it are the squeezed petty bourgeoisie, the small shop owners, the contractors, etc. Some of the billionaires and corporate heads sided with Trump, but most of that big money went to Biden. It was the small businesses that made a difference in terms of votes. People making over $100,000 went 54% to Trump. People making under $50,000 a year, the poor, was split by, it went to Biden, but only by 55%. That does represent a move of poor white people away from Trump, but only just enough to let Biden squeak through. Yet nationally, the Biden campaign was focused on middle-class suburban women. And the figures you hear about the Latino vote in the splits, they also kind of missed that the Latino vote was also split by class, by whether you're an employee or an employer. So Biden knew he had to appeal to workers in Pennsylvania and Michigan to win, but he didn't do that through class politics. It essentially through identity politics. I come from Scranton, PA. You know, I feel your pain. I'm the kind of guy you could have a beer with. That might have worked with some people, but it did not provide an answer, and it provided no reason for hope. Many rightly rejected the neoliberal politics from Democrats that never gave them anything. So it was essentially, you know, it was similar to 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton was a personification of the status quo when people wanted to go against the status quo. Who is Biden, besides the person who, you know, likes to, his whole raison d'etre as a long-time insider politician is compromised with Republicans. He also, his career started in Delaware as against busing, a method of school integration. He consistently, although he's, you know, he's not for overturning Roe v. Wade, he consistently voted for excluding abortions from federal funding for poor women's health care. On immigration, some of the stuff that people were most upset with Trump about, you know, the family separation policy and putting families in cages, actually with Obama had deported more people, but quietly. Those cages were built under the Obama administration. It's just that they put the families in them together instead of separating them. As Biden said to a big donor meeting, if elected, nothing would fundamentally change. In the campaign, he was against defunding the police. He wanted to increase police budgets. He loudly supports fracking. He's against the Green New Deal, even though that's the way you could talk about jobs. A majority of Americans now support comprehensive health care plan like Medicare for all, but Biden, you know, came out vehemently and repeatedly against it. In exit polls, 50% of voters expressed support for Black Lives Matter on election day, and the number was even higher at the height of the protests. But rather than connect with that feeling, Biden's committed to reaching compromise with the Republicans, you know, not wanting to alienate some racist vote out there, and how to best rule in the interest of corporations and U.S. imperialism. Biden told his supporters about Trump, history will treat this administration's time as an aberration. But really, Trump was not an aberration. He was a product of capitalism and how it reacts to crisis. So right now we see in the Democratic Party a lot of finger pointing about why they, how they didn't do as well as they thought, why they lost seats in the House, et cetera. The blue dog Democrats, the people in swing states, et cetera, like are saying no one should ever say defund the police again. They're blaming talk of socialism, of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is absolutely the wrong way around. Look, there were no demonstrations calling for abolish the police 4 years ago when Hillary Clinton lost, right? And in swing districts, as Ocasio-Cortez points out, every single candidate that sponsored Medicare for all kept their seat, and several who didn't lost. But again, the Democrats are missing the election. We have two capitalist parties in the United States. And it's a problem of people like AOC, a socialist running in the Democratic Party, is the majority in your party is always muddying your message if they're not actually trying to silence you or kick you out. But she's committed to working with them, right? If you have an electoral focus, you have to work in one of those parties, and it means you have to work with them. The differences were hidden in the campaign. The mainstream is coming out now. But there's no hint of any kind of split in the Democratic Party. They're all committed to working with each other. The people, like some of the people in some of the socialists, a few socialists in the Democratic Party have often made some good points, but they're not able to accomplish much. I think it's not so much if you're labeled a socialist or not, but that electoral focus. People in that position could be using that position actually to relate more to the demonstrations that are going on, to pull together some kind of ongoing coalition around Black Lives Matter and around the working class issues. The biggest growth in socialists in the United States has been the Democratic Socialist of America, and that's been a good sign. But again, they've been focusing on getting those socialists into office and in local elections, et cetera. And in a way, they've been training people who want to be socialists into how to use telephone lists, not to get, calling people up, not to get people together to do something for themselves, but to vote for somebody else. And this is at a time when the US, the legitimacy of the status quo, we were all taught were the sacred institutions of the greatest democracy in the world, the Supreme Court, et cetera, are in shreds. Biden is the personification of this bland moderate center, which is disappearing. Now, this opens up opportunities for the left, but also for the right. So, as I said, I think it's the job of socialists then to orient it towards those movements that are in the streets that have made such a difference and changed minds already. Those movements need organization. Right now in the States, there's a joy that Trump is gone, but there's also a worry about what he's created. People do not have the faith and the honeymoon with Biden. I mean, nobody has that kind of faith that they had with Obama or even with Bill Clinton. But at the same time, there's a kind of a feeling that we can rest a bit and maybe give him a chance. The left needs to say we need to keep going. We need to keep those movements going in the street. We have the crisis now, right? The coronavirus went from one case to 10 million in 10 months. There's now 240,000 dead. There's hospitals that are filled and filling in the Midwest. The economic crisis is simultaneous to this boom in millionaires. There's the extended pandemic unemployment benefits are set to expire at the end of the year, pushing even more people into poverty or unsafe jobs if they can find them. And there are hundreds of official wildcat strikes around the country, but no coordination of them. The Democrats have no solution and no connection to that activism. So we have a situation where close to half the voters have voted for the right wing for lack of a visible alternative. Capitalism itself has no solution to this, so we need to point to the scale of the changes that are needed. This will create fights with the Democratic administration. In a way, we're in an easier position now that we're fighting against the Democratic administration, because the left needs to focus independently of the Democrats. I don't mean an electoral focus, something that will win an election in 4 years' time, but it's necessary to have that independent focus, if we're going to stop the fascist threat, if we're going to take Black Lives Matter forward and the other movements, if workers and unemployed people are going to fight for their own interests. So just with the scale of the crisis, there will be struggles. We know that. It's the job of the left to help build those struggles and to generalize from those struggles and to build ourselves from those struggles if we want to see a better world. So, turn it over to Lewis.
Thanks, Eric. That was really great. I can see lots of people clapping for you. So we're going to go over to Lewis now, who will also speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll go into discussion.
Well, thanks a lot, Molly. And thanks a lot, Eric. It's fascinating to hear comrades over in the States and really, really useful to get a socialist perspective on what's happening. So it's brilliant to have you here, and thanks a lot for coming along. I mean, look, I think Eric knows much more about the topic than me. I just want to add 3 things which I think are relevant in what's going on in the States and are relevant to us here as well. I think there's 3 things we can learn about what's happened in America over the last week or so. And obviously we celebrate Trump going, you know, a defeat for Trump is a good thing. It's a defeat for every fascist, racist, bigot, homophobe, etc., etc. It's a defeat for them everywhere. But I think there's 3 important political lessons that we can learn. The first is that the election has showed the resilience of right-wing populism. Eric talked about it, but the fact that Trump, I think, is now approaching 72 million votes, I do find staggering. You need real analysis to understand why this has happened. The fact, you know, how is it that after 230,000 dead from COVID, after 4 years of racism, of bigotry, of transphobia, how is it that 10 million more people vote for Trump this time than they did in 2016? I think that's one of the big questions that we have to answer. And I'll be interested to hear what comrades think in the discussion. One of the responses I've seen on social media, on Facebook and so on, is to say, you know, that America's just full of stupid, racist, white working class people, and this explains it. Now, I'm sure there are there are definitely some racist white people in America, but I don't think that will do as an explanation, because we know, don't we, that Trump has a base in what, you know, the lower middle class, small business owners and so on. But clearly for this election, in some ways more so than he was in 2016, clearly for this election, he was able to significantly mobilize a working class base who rallied to his ideas. And while I have to think we have to be careful of falling into the, you know, the argument that America's just, you know, full of fascists or whatever, clearly the combination for Trump of the economic message around jobs and the economy with a toxic, nasty, overt racism towards Muslims, migrants, Mexicans, etc. Clearly that was very, very powerful at connecting with a deep bitterness at the base of US society. You know, big sections, you know, millions of people who have economic concerns and so on, Trump is able to drag those concerns to the right. And I think, you know, we have to start by recognizing that, because what flows from that is that even if, well, you know, even if you think he will, you do think it's game over for him now and he won't be able to cling on, even when he leaves on, what is it, January the 21st, the legacy of Trumpism will continue and Trumpism itself won't go away. You know, we can laugh at Trump for not accepting the result and for playing golf on Saturday and, you know, still tweeting out in capital letters and all that kind of thing. But the reality is that I bet he's hardening up a significant section of his base with him. I bet a significant section of that 71 million believe what Trump says and are on his side about this. And you know, he's hardening them up to say that, you know, the democratic process is a sham and that, you know, that we've been done over by the left and the establishment and the Democrats and so on. I think the other element is that what flows from that is that the far right, who Eric talked about, who have been emboldened by Trump over the last 4 or 5 years, not only will they be emboldened by the vote, but Trump's refusal to accept it, I think, will make them more likely to be more dangerous, you know, in many ways. You know, we saw over the summer vigilante gangs, you know, against Black Lives Matter and so on. Those gangs now will feel as if the election is stolen, and they'll look at the size of the vote and they'll feel very much emboldened. The other aspect of it, I think, is that the Republican Party, as far as I can tell, shows no signs of leaving Trumpism behind. If anything, the Republican Party is now in the hands of the radical right and the populist right. It doesn't look like it's going to go back to the days of John McCain or Mitt Romney. Not that anyone here would want it to, but you know, it really feels as if the base of the Republican Party and some of the candidates coming through are even more Trumpian than Trump, and even in some ways more competent and less all over the place. So I think that's the first thing we have to recognise, that the resilience of right-wing populism, like Eric said, is a huge challenge and a huge task for the left in America. The second lesson I think over the last week we've learned is the weakness of the liberal centre. Remember that right up until election day, right up until the polls closed, you had commentators, columnists, you know, people on TV shows, you know, opinion poll experts saying that Biden was heading for a landslide, that the last 4 years had been an aberration, and that last Tuesday we were going to see that put right by Biden, the ultimate safe liberal candidate who's been involved for politics for 45 years. That's fallen spectacularly on his face. Not just is Biden scraping into the White House. They didn't win the Senate. They haven't made gains in the House, and they've actually lost some state legislature elections. You know, important states where stuff like abortion rights and that kind of thing is decided, the Democrats have lost. So although Biden wins, it very much feels like a hollow victory for him. And Eric covered this a lot about why it is that Biden's vote was so underwhelming. You know, in 2016, the Democrats could blame the Russia scandal, Hillary Clinton's emails, the fact that Bernie Sanders supporters apparently didn't get behind them and whatever. This time, there's nowhere to hide. There is an attempt by right-wing Democrats to blame the left, as Eric talked about. But really what's clear is that the hopes of Biden being the person to prop up and revive the liberal centre have fallen flat. His message of business as usual, of let's get back to normal, let's go back to the way things were, that did not significantly excite millions of working class Americans. It didn't significantly win back big amounts of people who left the Democrats or didn't vote for the Democrats in 2016, and they didn't come back soon, and they didn't come back now. And you know, the right will blame the left, but the reality is that faced with an insurgent like Trump, faced with someone who tries to portray himself as an anti-establishment candidate, the fact that Joe Biden not just stood for business as normal, but distanced himself from Medicare for all during a global pandemic, you know, distanced himself from Black Lives Matter, was soft on the Green New Deal and so on, I think meant that his moderate message ended up inspiring no one. And I think there's big lessons for us here. Keir Starmer is trying to drag the Labour Party in a similar direction to Joe Biden and the Democrats. Keir Starmer is chasing the centre ground in British politics to win over disaffected Tory voters and to try and take the Labour Party closer to the days of Tony Blair than it has been under Jeremy Corbyn. The US election should be a lesson for the Labour right who want to take it in that direction, that the politics, you know, in a time of crisis, of pandemic and so on, sticking to the liberal centre, taking the centre ground is a recipe for disaster. And I think the lesson from that is that Joe Biden just got away with it in the States. Final thing I think we have to say, the third thing I just want to make, the point I want to make, is about what happens next. Because I think it's right to say we celebrate Trump is gone, but immediately, as I know that comrades like Eric are doing, we have to prepare for the battles under a Biden presidency. There's lots of fawning in the media, in the Guardian, etc., about Biden, about Kamala Harris in particular, about them being progressive, about them being woke and so on. We know that their individual records in politics is that every time they side with big business, with the 1% against working class people. Joe Biden authored the 1994 crime bill that led to mass incarceration. He worked with segregationists in the 1970s. He's played a key role in dragging the Democrats to the right and to, full embrace of neoliberalism. And Kamala Harris herself, her record as Attorney General in California is questionable, to say the least. So because of that, but also because of the role that the Democrats have played, both in opposition as a shock absorber to radical movements and in government as not delivering for ordinary people, I think that what we have to say is that it's good Trump's gone. Now the fight against Biden depends on what happens outside of Congress and outside of the White House. Because with all the horror we've seen in America over the last 4 or 5 years, we also have to remember we've seen one of the biggest mass movements in US history, the Black Lives Matter stuff. We've seen a big climate movement that's raised the question of a Green New Deal. We've seen women's marches, record strike numbers for 32 years, big interest in socialist ideas that Eric Fretz talked about. And therefore, the key, I think, to defeating the remnants of Trump and the legacy he will leave, but also to providing a new path to challenge what Biden represents and the neoliberalism on the Democrats, I think means that the absolute focus has to be on those struggles as the way to really change things in America, and crucially to offer an alternative to the Democrat politics, which we've seen as a dead end so many times in the past. So I think going forward, and with people we talk to and all the arguments we have with people, both sides of the Atlantic, we have to welcome the defeat of Trump, but say that now that the battles start, and the battles, we best arm ourselves in those battles by building the movements and not relying on the Democrats to do it for us. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lewis.
Could Saunders, who have pulled some of the Trump? Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think anyone who looks at it says yes. Saunders. A lot of the people who voted Trump had voted Obama. A lot of the alienated working class vote that went to Trump could have gone to Saunders. Does that mean Bernie Sanders would have won? I don't know. I mean, the knives would have out for him even more. There are sections of the bourgeoisie and the big bosses who backed Biden because of stability. Who maybe if it was Sanders versus Trump, they would have moved over to fascism. Who knows if he would have won or not? But the race would have been some more fundamental ideas, between Trump and Sanders. Kamala Harris. No, it's I think the movement and the Black Lives Movement now especially has gone beyond the black faces in high places. It's a movement against police violence. She was a prosecutor. She prosecuted low level like marijuana convictions, wanted a higher sense of those, which disproportionately affected Black and minority people. She went after truants, jailing children. She defended the 3 strikes and you're out policy in California, specifically harsh version in California, so that if you had your third felony, minor crime, it would put you in jail. All the rest of that stuff. And Biden needed sort of a Black female immigrant to attack to use when attacking the left, because it looked better. But Black Lives Matter happened before Trump. You remember the rebellions in Baltimore. Obama was president, a Black president. Baltimore had a Black mayor. The police chief was Black. They were still rebelling against police violence. I don't think that there are, of course, there are sections of people who call themselves Black Matter. It's not a unified movement who say, Kamala Harris is a woman of color. But the vast majority of people who are on the streets are not taken in by that. What are some of the other this is working, the bitterness and working class people, the strikes. we actually haven't seen as many strike days this year as we had when there was last year when you had the GM strikes and before that when you had the schools out. But what you have seen is a lot of business and a very small, isolated, the kind of the both official and unofficial. You know, in a lot of healthcare places and some of the meatpacking places, there was some official actions, but there were a lot of it was small. The unofficial ones were quickly isolated. It shows that the mood is there, but that's why the left needs to be involved to kind of bring these people together. The strike for Black Lives exactly was not a strike in that, you know, almost all the instances. It was 8.5 minutes of people taking a knee, but it showed that workers wanted to take a knee, wanted to support Black Lives, wanted to walk out of work, and saw the workplace as a good place to do this. The union bureaucracy was forced into even calling that strike for Black Lives. It wasn't a strike. In some places like San Francisco, the janitors were able to use, because political strikes are illegal, they were able to use some other kind of issues they had and line it up on that day and actually strike and walk out of work for that day. And it shows that the mood is there, but it needs to be capitalized on. It needs to be pushed from below. And Black Lives Matter is instrumental. If the left is instrumental in sort of connecting that and saying that the workplaces are the places how to push on union bureaucracy to do that. And I agreed with Rahman. I did not agree with all this thing that it was going to be a Biden sweep. I wasn't sure about Trump winning. And exactly, it's the left. It's the people who are much to the left of Biden who decided to vote for him to get rid of Trump. It was people who were doing immigrant organizing in Arizona that brought out the Latino vote that brought out Biden's vote in Arizona. Similarly in Georgia, Black Lives Matter brought out young people who were way to the left of voting for Biden, who voted for Biden anyway because that was the only alternative. The question, and so yes, it brought out a lot more people. The question that were against Trump, but what were they for? That's the problem of the vote. That's why there needs to be something besides that vote for them for people to do next. And then the big question is on the far right. Yes, you saw all sorts of little, really fascist groups, a huge multiplication of them and growth of them under 4 years of Trump. The one kind of group that grew under Obama was not kind of the alt-right fascist group, but those kind of racist militias that were kind of hidden in the countryside. They kind of grew under Obama because they were angry at a black president. What you saw under Trump was the alt-right. They were in a way kicked back after Charlottesville, after the mobilization of tens of thousands in Boston after Charlottesville. They were deplatformed a lot of places. There was a lot of victory by anti-fascists against the alt-right. But then around coronavirus, you saw those. You saw actually kind of a scary unification of the militia types who came out armed on the reopen movements, often bankrolled by the industries and the shops that wanted things reopened. And they, and that's a scary moment when you see business people say, we can use the far right for something, because that's when they get dangerous. And they were working with the Proud Boys and the other kind of alt-right. And yes, if they're angry about this being stolen from them, if you have someone, Biden, who's a neoliberal, who's not going to provide anything to the working class, but has been tied in the minds of the more right-wing Trump supporters with Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all the rest of that, it makes things even dangerous. It does you do have a situation where the right could unite more, and in a more anti-government way. They've been kind of split between sort of system loyal and not, and are we for the police or not for the police under Trump? But they could unite in a much more unified way, and that's why fighting them. Black Lives Matter still outnumbers them, but not everybody sees the best way of uniting, across political differences in order to smash the right. And I think that's a big role that Marx21 is very, very small, but one of the things we're doing is trying to build those coalitions with a lot of other people and convince people in the DSA and stuff why that is necessary. that right wing needs to be smashed. And yes, there is a role of capitalists. There is, if you look at Dark Money and Democracy and Change and all those books, there's a section of big capital that spent a long time in the backgrounds knowing if we do this openly, it doesn't work. We have to have a grassroots, you know, they bankrolled Tea Party stuff, and there's a certain amount way in which they're bankrolling the far right. But that's not the majority of capital now. The majority of capital still wants stability, and the majority of big capital were backing Biden. But if there are going to be struggles, there will be more strikes. You know, whether whether more of the ruling class then sees the use of the far right to break those strikes or not, depends if we can break the far right first. Yes, I don't have any. I'm afraid there's not going to be a viable party outside the Democrats in anything like the near future. It's going to win elections. There are going to be growth in left organization, and it's that, and there are going to be good upsurges and all that. And I think that is all you can do is relate to all those movements, but also show how they're related to capitalism and how, you know, the bigger changes that we need to put forward. Sorry, I've been going on a bit long, so I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Eric. That was really great. Okay, we're going to go over to Lewis now.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for a very interesting discussion. And again, thanks to Eric. It's been brilliant hearing you. Look, I just want to finish really on two quick points. The first is around Kamala Harris. Someone asked, you know, about what the prospects for her being president or whatever. I think there's a saying, isn't there, that the vice president is a heartbeat away from being president. It's probably, that likelihood's a bit increased when you look at someone like Joe Biden at the age of 78, who's been through a bit of a grueling campaign. So we might feel, well, and you know, there's talk of him only running for one term and staying in there for one term. I mean, look, Kamala Harris has had a lot of media attention. And look, on the one hand, right, we understand why it is that people are pleased to see her elected. You know, you see that, I mean, all the Black Lives Matter groups in Britain, you know, on Instagram and stuff have been celebrating it. You see that, you know, the front page of one of the newspapers where it's got the, you know, 60 odd white men who preceded her, and now you've got a black woman and so on. So, you know, you can understand why there's why there is excitement, especially amongst Black Lives Matter activists. However, if you look at her record, right, not just as the governor, as the Attorney General of California, but also Kamala Harris comes from the right wing of the Democrats, who have pushed through not just neoliberalism that, you know, has impoverished workers and impoverished black workers in particular, but also have gone along with some of the worst instances of institutional racism and have done nothing to address the question of structural racism in America. I mean, Eric made the point, but the last Black Lives Matter movement came about because in 2013, Freddie Gray in Baltimore was killed by cops, some of whom were black. There were, you know, it was a black Democrat mayor in the town. It's a black state under a black president. And there's similarities with George Floyd in the summer, isn't there, about it happening in Minneapolis, where, you know, black Democrats are very much in power. And I think, you know, one of the things we have to point to with Kamala Harris is, while of course we want to see more people of color in positions, politics does matter. You know, identity politics on steroids is not a way to take the Black Lives Matter movement forward. And all the work that, you know, socialists and anti-racists and stuff are doing in the States and on the ground there is really important. The second point I just wanted to make was the question of Bernie Sanders. Could Bernie Sanders have won the election? I mean, look, to be honest, we don't know, right? Of course, we have no idea of telling. Given how energetic, how inspiring, how, you know, what a lightning rod Sanders' campaign to run for the nomination this time and last time, the way it brought people to socialist ideas, the way it changed the national debate, to have him running in the presidential race would have significantly shifted things, whether he'd won or not. And it would have really opened up a big potential, I think. Now, you know, he would have come under huge pressure about being a democratic socialist and whatever, right? They've seen it, you know, all the pressure that's being put on the left now the election's over. Imagine what would have happened, right? The pressure they put on Biden about apparently being a socialist. Imagine the pressure that Sanders would have come under. What would his response been like? You know, because while we can say that the Sanders campaign was inspiring, to be honest, the most disappointing thing for me is how he came straight in behind Joe Biden with no qualifications. As soon as Sanders lost the race to be the nominee this year, in a matter of days, he was well in behind Biden and urging his supporters to do so. And there's rumours, I don't know if they're true, Eric, but, you know, there's rumours he might serve in Biden's cabinet as a Minister of Labour and so on. And so while we can recognise that what Sanders represented and gave voice to was a hugely positive development in America, and alongside all the other stuff that I've talked about, I think now there's a big, big question about how we beat the remnants of Trumpism, but also about how that new American left can go forward. And will there be a break from the Democrats? I think it's great to see, to be honest, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at least having the argument. I think it puts the debate on a much better terrain for us. I don't think she'll break, but the fact that she, you know, gave that interview in the New York Times the other day, I think is an important thing, because I think it shifts the debate. We also have to recognise as well that within that debate, there's lots of different positions. For example, if you look at Jacobin and Bhaskar Sankara, you know, the online magazine who he's the editor of, Jacobin want a break from the Democrats at some point down the line, but when they talk about a break, you know, they talk about maybe setting up a social democratic party like we've got in Britain and around Europe. Now, obviously that would be a good thing in America, but we know our experience with Corbyn, having a left-wing leader of a social democratic party doesn't guarantee you success, right? There's also much bigger questions to raise. So therefore, when we talk about, you know, what's going on in the Democrats, the arguments about what organization we need, the question of struggle is an incredibly important one. Because if you look over the last year, what has been the real game changer in the States? It hasn't been what Democrats have done. It hasn't been what the DSA has done, as positive as their development is. The real game changer has been the eruption of the Black Lives Matter stuff. You know, when you look at the figures, when they say that 26 million people marched for it, well, if you compare that in 2017, 5 million people marched for the Women's March, which had big money behind it, which had the Democrats behind it and so on, the spontaneous nature of individuals in their town or their city or their neighborhood taking to the streets, calling for mass change, you know, calling for mass movement, that is the thing which can provide the best hope in America for beating back Trump and beating Biden. So I think, you know, what Eric talked about in the coming months and years, the crucial question for socialists here, but especially in America, has to be about building those movements, drawing them to their most radical conclusions, and at the same time trying to fight for political organization, which isn't just a Democrats Mark II or a Labour Party light or whatever, but is an organization which is built and orientated on struggle and recognizes that it's those things that can really change the world. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Lewis.